welcome to High Point, Aaron and Peter.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Mark.
No problem. We've been talking for a while before, and there's been a few problems with the technology, but it's okay. We're here. You're not the first architects, but I like receiving architects on the podcast because usually there's a lot of really interesting things they know. Not that other guests have not been interesting, but you always have a really interesting perspective to me. And so I've got loads of questions to ask you about, obviously, Grimshaw, how your approach of the firm to sustainability, your experiences, some projects you've got, some perspective from different continents, because obviously, Peter, you're based in London, and Aaron, you're based in LA. So I think we're going to have some really interesting chats, maybe political as well. But yeah. First of all, can I ask you both to introduce yourselves? Maybe Aaron, you can start.
So, indeed, I'm joining you from Los Angeles. We have a studio here. Grimshaw have a studio here. Maybe Peter will give a global view. I'll tell you that I lead Grimshaw's North American studios relative to sustainability and increasingly regenerative design and resilience. I was in the New York office for many years. I joined Grimshaw actually back in 2010 to support our Miami Science Museum project for more than a few years, and loved being in the New York office. But I'm out in LA. We started an LA office in 2016, and we started a sustainability department a few years after that. And that's when Peter and I got to know each other with the formation of this department and some global commitments that our chairman made. And then I'll pass it over to Peter because he'll start there. I don't know.
Thanks, Aaron. Yes, I mean, in terms of my involvement at Grimshaw, I started just after Aaron back in 2012. So I've been in practice almost 13 years now. I started in our Sydney studio, and I moved across to London back in 2014, and I spearheaded a number of projects in the London office, including working for the University of Cambridge, which is a fantastic opportunity to put into practice the sustainability knowledge and the experience that I gained through my sort of early days of my career and through my education at Manchester University. And that then really led to working towards this idea of developing a dedicated sustainability team within Grimshaw, sort of building on the work that we've done across our projects and trying to formalise that into a department that can help spearhead commitments that we've made as a practice. And back in 2019, when all of that kind of coalesced, our chairman made a number of commitments that the practice was going to focus on over the next decade, those including delivering net zero carbon ready designs by the end of this year, and then looking forward beyond that to 2030, looking to deliver regenerative designs, and Aaron touched on that. So that's something that we both, within our respective regions, are focused on helping deliver, helping to upskill our architects and build capacity within the studios that we operate under, and helping to really drive that agenda, and then helping the wider industry with the knowledge that we've gained and the experience in our projects to sort of disseminate that and then help to accelerate the movement towards those two commitments.
Maybe it's worth saying that it's a practice. Grimshaw as a practice has been around, really since the 60s. Sir Nick Grimshaw has been practicing architecture since then, and even kind of got to know Buckminster Fuller, who was an American architect, kind of famous for geodesic structures and very long books and multi-day long lectures on Earth and sustainability before there was a term such sustainability. But so Sir Nick Grimshaw was interested in issues of material efficiency and the beauty of industrial kind of products and their application in architecture. And you can look at the Grimshaw website and see that throughout its long history. But the practice itself got started in 1980 and became quite famous with that Eden project at Cornwall, kind of an expression of material efficiency and also regenerative design, because it was an old clay pit factory. So probably Peter could tell more detail about that, but it's a beautiful story. Anyway, so Grimshaw has this long history in sustainability, and the department only got going in 2019, but we got to build on that foundation.
I didn't know this. Obviously, I've known a lot of people know Grimshaw from reputation, but I didn't realize this. I'm going to start with a very naive question. I think it's still quite important. Why do we need sustainability leads in architecture companies? And what do you do as well?
Good. So that's a fantastic question to open with. We could take up a whole podcast, I imagine, just on that one subject. I think one of the key things that we realised within the practice when we were looking at establishing these commitments and formulating the department was that there's a level of complexity to the themes and material issues around sustainability that one project lead or, on a larger project, a number of project leads simply don't have the capacity to be able to manage that. So it's really about spearheading what's important on a given project and helping find and support architects in finding solutions to meet those sustainability agendas as they were developing the project, but also helping where there weren't necessarily clients that were spearheading that agenda or a project team that had the capability to really come in and help support the development of the scope around developing a sustainability narrative and a strategy that could support that. And sometimes when we were working on projects that are already adopting certification schemes like LEED or BREEAM, it was looking at where the opportunities were to go above and beyond and look into the space of sort of R&D and opportunities to kind of push the envelope and the boundaries beyond business as usual, which we know obviously we have to do to tackle things like the climate emergency or move into the regenerative and just design sort of transition.
I'm curious what level of jargon is going to be your audience is going to be like willing to suffer, because architects, if you've hung out with enough of us, know that we use a lot of words that other people don't use. And I don't know how annoying it is because I spend most of my time with architects and engineers who put up with us and don't tell us how annoying we are. But does sustainability resonate in the same way that like green design does, or the same way that, what other terms? Because sustainability to us is a term which means a lot of things depending on who you're talking to. So like sustainable development means one thing to somebody who's like focused on all kinds of issues. It could be public health and economics even. But to us, it means something a little different. But anyway, I'd be curious, Mark, if you have any steer on jargon and unpacking terms, if you think it's helpful.
Well, I'm not an architect, so I could ask you to clarify any terms or anything, but just assume you're speaking to engineers or non-architect people.
Okay.
And people who are not even in the construction industry, but although I think most of them are. There's no data on this, actually. And I roughly know who listens to the podcasts and, well, obviously the countries and the age. But I don't know their profession.
I mean, I think Peter and I might even have slightly different definitions of sustainability, because working in North America, sustainability has come to mean almost LEED, the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED certification program for buildings. And but certainly more broadly, sustainability is design and construction that leads to less negative impacts to the environment and the people who are in the buildings or occupying the buildings. And that's the simple definition. So doing less harm. But there's a definition that the UN created some years back, I think even back in the 70s, that was about, development in such a way that doesn't negatively impact future generations. So there's a few important definitions out there, and probably everybody needs to craft and recraft their definition in time, in context, and because it's all about change, isn't it? It's about, because our understanding of the impacts are changing. We understand, for instance, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a much bigger deal we know that as architects now. It was a much bigger deal now than it was 15 years ago, even though it actually was a big deal 15 years ago. We just didn't know about it as much, right? As far as the impact of materials. We thought about it on the energy side, but we weren't thinking about it on the materials side as much. Anyway, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but as far as unpacking terms, sustainability is a good one. It's a loaded one, and it's a one where when you hear us say we lead sustainability for Grimshaw in our respective regions, and then we also say we're going into regenerative design, you may ask yourself, well, first of all, what was sustainability, and why are you now going to regenerative? And what is resilience? So it's maybe worth just saying sustainability has generally been about doing less harm, but we all think that we have to go beyond sustainability. because keeping your head above water, so to speak, is not very inspirational. And we do need to be inspired in our action. Otherwise, we probably won't build the right coalitions, right, for positive change. That takes energy, and that takes community building and capacity building. And it's hard to do that if you're just saying, let's just keep our head above water here. Sustainability is the way to go. So that's why we're talking about resilience. So, being able to support each other in our communities through shocks and change, which are already baked into the system and the challenges we face. And then regenerative is saying we can even do better than doing less harm. We can change and transform places so that they're doing good. A building that makes more energy than it needs, and sends that energy out into the community, and maybe even helps during power outages in that sense. Or a building that's able to clean water and share that water, or to regrow landscapes that were otherwise, those landscapes were removed and had no ecological value. Those are all elements of sustainability, resilience, and regenerative design that we're all participating in all of our projects at different levels. Each project has its own opportunities.
Peter?
I was going to say, I'd add to that as well, that I think another key part of our role is bringing clients on a journey to understand what they can have a meaningful impact on. We said before, can be a huge topic. It can be very complicated. There can be a lot of competing narratives or definitions around what you're trying to achieve in terms of outcomes. So sometimes it's about reducing that down to what is the thing that you, for this project, want to use as a beacon to gather everybody sort of collectively around in order to kind of spearhead, a key change or demonstrate something through that particular project. And it can sometimes be one thing or multiple things. A lot of our projects at the moment are very much focused on achieving net zero carbon, or demonstrating that the design is ready to lead towards an operational net zero carbon ready building. That in itself, myself and Aaron could do multiple podcasts just on net zero, because it's such a complex topic, and has various different levels of understanding and alignment within different regions. So that's another key part of our role, is understanding where each region is specifically, and then how that relates to other regions, particularly when you're operating out of, say, a London studio, but you're working on a project, say, in Dubai. You have to have that understanding of that nuance, and helping clients sort of get on board with that, socializing it with them, and then also help them understand how to deal with the perceived risks. Often we deal in risks that are there because of a lack of knowledge. So it's often about helping a client understand that there might be a requirement to do a little bit more upfront, but it's going to pay dividends later. An example of that might be that you're investing slightly more capex upfront to achieve a better energy performance, but that's going to pay dividends later. And then looking at things from that perspective, sometimes you have to bring things, sometimes I'm reluctant to do this across the board, but sometimes you have to bring things down to sort of a monetary level. So there's an understanding there about, you want to spend a little bit, or you want to spend your money more wisely up front, but it's going to pay those dividends later. And if you can start to talk the language of clients and those that they surround themselves with in terms of the other advice that they get from project managers and from cost managers, you can start to inform sort of the direction of the project and show them what's possible. I mean, a lot of it is about the art of the possible, and then helping them gear up the team for success so you can de-risk the project, and then get to that point where you're more likely to achieve the outcome that you're collectively gathering behind to push.
So
have you got any
Mark,
examples?
does that answer your question about why practices have sustainability leads? Did we kind of capture that? Yeah, because I mean, part of it was like back in 2019 when the chairman said all of our projects will be net zero carbon ready by the end of 2025 and socially and environmentally regenerative by 2030. We had to get together and decide what that even meant. We had to define that and put together the papers to kind of clarify that in a science and evidence-based manner. Once we did that, build up training for the staff, and then find the tools to help them to do it. And then, like Peter just said, join project workshops and help everybody understand, including even ourselves, understand what the drivers were of the projects and how to align those drivers with sustainable, project goals, and then to deliver them in a way that are aligned with the value of that client, because that's the biggest opportunity.
Can you give something, both, maybe one example or two examples if you think there's two really interesting ones, but to make it more concrete and understand what's the benefit of your work and your responsibilities? Go on, Peter.
I was going to say, I would say one of the projects that really informed my approach to how I've undertaken the role over the last few years was a collaboration with the University of Cambridge. I was the project lead for both the master plan for the new engineering department campus in West Cambridge. They're currently based, they're based in a number of locations, but most of the department is based on Trumpington Street, which is in the centre of Cambridge. And about a decade ago, we were commissioned to look at a master plan to move the department to the west of Cambridge as part of a new science cluster. But also looking at part of that, the first phase was to move the civil engineering department over to West Cambridge as part of that move. That was a fantastic experience because we had a client, albeit a university client, which are very often multi-headed. We had an engineering team who were absolutely adamant that sustainability had to be front and center of any decision making that we made, and very specifically looking at how energy and costs were used to demonstrate any design decisions that we made. So because of that early buy-in from the engineering department and the very clear brief from them that they needed to have a good level of governance put into decision making, that really helped build momentum as we developed the design to get buy-in from all of the stakeholders that were involved in the project, from the estates department to other subdivisions within the engineering department and other adjacent departments that were going to be neighbours to the engineers. Bringing them collectively together and having a very robust methodology for understanding how you make decisions really helped inform that process. So we came up with what was called the energy cost metric, which was a means by which we could look at undertaking robust energy reductions through the design, but doing that within a cost-conscious framework. So we were understanding essentially what we called it was that you're getting your bang for your buck. Every pound that you were spending, you were achieving the maximum possible energy or carbon saving as a consequence of spending the money, but also being conscious of the fact we didn't have an infinite budget. We were working within a very constrained budget. So putting that level of rigor behind it gave a lot of reassurance to the estates department that we were able to achieve the maximum possible within those constraints. But also it gave us a means by which we could get buy-in from the contractors. So when we tendered for the job to get a main contractor on board, all of that was put into the employer's requirements. So they had to take the baton from us. So any value engineering or any design proposals they wanted to make as they went into construction detailing, they could see those through the lens of having this methodology. And that has been something I've used and reused across projects subsequently, because it's really valuable to be able to get everybody on board and understand what you're trying to achieve, having a very rigorous process in terms of assessing designs, and also doing that with full sight of your limits that you're working within. And then you can kind of expand that beyond carbon and energy. You can start to look at health and wellbeing metrics, and you can start to look at other things like social value, investing in local communities, looking at circular economy opportunities, and you can start to broaden that remit beyond using that sort of process. It gets more challenging, obviously, the more things you're trying to bake into that decision-making process. But that was a project that's really sort of informed the approach. And what I'm currently doing, the second phase at the engineering department called the Whittle Lab, which is an existing lab that's looking to expand part of the effort actually to decarbonise the aviation industry. If you don't know the name Whittle was Frank Whittle was instrumental in inventing the jet engine and sort of starting the whole aviation industry. So being part of that project as well is kind of perfect sort of overlap in terms of looking at decarbonisation within the built environment, but then also helping to propel another industry efforts to decarbonise at the same time. And we took, again, all of that work that we did on the civil engineering building, we used again to good effect on the Whittle building. And we've, as a consequence, with Max Fordhams, who were the engineers on the project, and they were the MEP engineers. We also had Smith and Warwick, who were the structural engineers. The work that we've done there has now been codified into the design guides for the university. So that's a fantastic endorsement of the work that's been undertaken, that it's considered robust enough by the Estates Department to actually put that into their design guides for future projects. So that's one example. I'd say one of probably the most insightful one that's really helped myself. I'd be interested in terms of Aaron, maybe a more recent project that you've worked on with.
I mean, more recent. I mean, yeah, I'll say that the project that we completed at Arizona State University in Tempe for their Walton Center for Planetary Health, which was about a $300 million project, is quite a large kind of research and office complex there on their campus. But when we initially got the project, and I know that part of what we were going to talk about today had to do with mass timber. That project was a very large lab project, and they thought maybe it should be mass timber. But it spanned over a light rail and over a historic canal that had been there and had been built by indigenous people in the valley there. And so it had to do a lot of things, this building. And after researching and touring the United States, going up to Quebec and looking at UMass Amherst's most recent mass timber project, the physical plant team thought that a building of that size, it was going to have wet labs, was probably just a bridge too far for them. So for various reasons, that was just one of them. There were others, including costs. It was determined that it should be a concrete building. So, and that didn't really come as a surprise because nobody had built a mass timber building of that size in the United States. But we had done a lot of good research, and they were going to put that in their back pocket for the next opportunity that might be a better fit. So it wasn't waste. And one thing I'd like to say about projects that we pursue as Grimshaw is we get hired, I think, when design excellence is important, but the project comes with a certain amount of complexity. And when we're doing sustainability right, in my opinion, we're doing these projects that other people can replicate. Like maybe we've taken on the risk, we've had the right kind of expert group of engineers and other consultants to come in and help us manage the risk together. And with the client, we've assessed whether or not it's the right decision for the project, right? That's hard. Every project doesn't have that level of expertise, but what you want to do is you want to be transparent enough to show that you've done the work, and you want to report out what the barriers were. The next project may not face those same barriers. You want it to be replicable. So when it went to concrete, what we did though is, and this is based on another project we did in Dubai, the sustainability pavilion there in 2020, we integrated a void form into the concrete, meaning you can put in these spheres, these plastic spheres, recycled plastic spheres into the concrete. It removes the concrete from the neutral axis of the concrete slab so that you're basically taking material out where it's not doing any structural work. And you can remove more than 30% of the concrete from a structure. So I thought to myself, let's bring this in. So we talked to our engineers. They said, we're interested. We had just worked with the same engineers, Burra-Happold, on that Dubai project. So kind of it's one way that Grimshaw works effectively is we tend to work with some of the same engineers on different projects. So if we've had one conversation on that project, we can transfer it over. So indeed, we looked at it for ASU. Concrete is the main structural systems that are deployed in Arizona and in Phoenix. So we thought, well, here's change. We're going to show how to integrate this project into this project that hasn't been done before. And sure enough, they did it. And it's a big building. It's 3 big wings that form a triangle. And we did it on the largest. And that's where it was cost neutral. So it introduced no new cost, but it introduced an innovation that hadn't been done in that region before. And that company that built it, McCarthy Construction, self-performed the concrete. So they delivered that, and they're really proud of it. If you Google ASU bubble deck, you can see that even the company that delivered the bubble deck wrote ASU in the bubble deck system, which is this port. It was a huge success and made a big splash. Sometimes breaking through to the market is about these kinds of experiments, if you will, that are managed really well, where they don't introduce costs. They are aligned with the mission. It is a Center for Planetary Health. It is a way of building in Arizona, which is more typical than anything else. And we did do the research on mass timber. So ASU will eventually build a mass timber building. They have gone and made those connections into industry in Canada and Quebec, British Columbia, and they've met the team at UMass Amherst, so they know what the issues were with that mass timber building. So I feel like that's a little bit how change happens, and as a sustainability lead in North America, getting into those conversations and helping the team feel good about the decision to go into concrete. I remember when I showed up and they said, we're not going to do mass timber, Aaron, you're going to be very depressed. And I said, let's think about what is the transformational opportunity here still. This is a concrete town. If we can show that you can do void form and remove 30% of the concrete with this system without adding cost, that can help transform this market. We're trying to decarbonize. We're not just trying to deliver mass timber buildings, right? So anyway, that's one story.
No, that's a really interesting point. And my next question was going to be, do we always have to use mass timber to have a net zero building? Is that the right term? maybe we can use other forms of timber constructions or timber, or not just timber. What's your experience and opinion? And also after that, there will be also the question of cost, because mass timber seems, and a lot of projects I've worked on, especially the big ones, and not I'd say not residential projects, not I'd say standard residential projects, but as you step into entertainment spaces, venues and sports venues, and maybe education as well, it starts to ramp up in terms of costs, and it's not affordable anymore. Sorry, one question. Do we always have to use mass timber basically to what's your experience, and do you have any data that you know about?
I was going to say from an experience perspective, I think, Aaron, you've probably had a little bit more experience of late in actually working through the design and the barriers to actually implementing mass timber designs in the States. I think from a UK context, I think it's something we've explored on a number of projects. We tend to explore when we're looking at design optioneering, specifically around structural solutions. We try and look at things not just from business as usual perspective, but looking at bringing in mass timber, but also looking at hybrid structures and understanding what the whole life carbon picture is for those combined systems. It's often not it's not as easy as you'd hope to be able to navigate some of the complexities when you're looking at timber supply chains. You're looking at the whole life carbon, also looking at life cycle stages beyond sort of stages A to C, which is looking obviously the upfront carbon, which is stage A, operational, which is B, and then C is looking at end of life. It's looking at what can you do in terms of that complete picture at the end of life. Where does that timber go? Is it being burnt or is it being reused back in to the supply chain? They're all things that come into play when you're trying to make a decision around timber. And I've found through projects in the UK, it's often when you look at all of those holistically, timber doesn't always come out on top in terms of when you're comparing it to a hybrid system, say the steel frame with CLT infill planks for the floor deck. It can get a bit more nuanced. Again, though, markets come into play in terms of if you're working, say, in the Middle East, timber is probably not something you would explore unless you can find a very robust supply chain to bring that timber into that region. So you've got to look at the thing holistically. But I'd say of late, probably some of our biggest successes have probably been the US market in terms of integrating mass timber into our projects.
It's a big topic, Mark. I will start here though. There has been a lot of timber in North America since the 19th century. All the building up of these cities in America was generally timber. All that 19th century building, and in the early 20th century, it wasn't until and for example, it wasn't really until the kind of middle 20th century where steel and concrete was replacing wood, even in industrial and commercial buildings, as the primary structural members. But once that happened, the non-residential commercial buildings were then built of concrete and steel. Now, what we've seen is that there is some change, right? I mean, 5 to 10% of commercial buildings are built using wood. Now, some of those are kind of low-rise schools and retail spaces, but that's 5 to 10% currently. Of course, 90% of residential buildings in the United States are built of wood. 90% of residential is built of wood in the U.S. Only 1% of non-residential construction in the United States is built of mass timber elements. Now, you could say, could that grow? Yes. Will it grow? Most likely. What will cause that to grow? All kinds of things. Federal incentives, state incentives, clients like, a lot of the tech clients started building with mass timber in the Bay Area, for example. Now, are they doing that because of climate action? A little bit. Are they doing it because there's a perception that improves health and well-being and even productivity of workers? That's probably a bigger driver. When I see the market change within commercial space, it tends to be because the client believes that they'll get better tenants if it's mass timber. It's not because they've done the whole building life cycle assessment. And when you choose mass timber, you get closer to getting the targets that science has said the building industry should be going after. Was one thing we didn't talk about is that there's various metrics out there for what we as architects and engineers should be trying to get to in terms of reduction of the carbon that we find in the building materials, which we call embodied carbon. A lot of people think we should be targeting a 40% reduction in embodied carbon, the carbon found in these construction materials. And we should be kind of going after that 40% reduction from a business as usual point of view. So if it was steel or concrete, we should be able to beat that by 40% when going into 2030. We're trying to do that. And as I can tell you that you can get there in different ways. It doesn't have to be mass timber, but if you can replace the floor systems, which are either typically concrete or steel and concrete, composite decks, et cetera, if you can replace that with cross-laminated timber, you're getting pretty far. And then if you can additionally replace the beams and the columns with glue laminated structures, you're getting still further. And if you get all this wood from sustainable managed forests, you can take, and this gets controversial, but you can take the biogenic carbon storage, the carbon stored in that wood fiber, and further achieve your carbon kind of sequestration and reduction goals together, getting very close to that 40%. Once you consider everything else as well, the enclosure, right, the facade and all that, and the insulation and the interior materials and et cetera. So once you include all of those things into the built project, you can see that it gets very hard to get that 40% unless you have something of material like mass timber that can actually both be itself a reduction in embodied carbon, but can even sequester and be a carbon sink, if you will. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, and we're seeing Grimshaw, we typically look at our projects with a wood first approach. If it's allowed by code, we look at it at wood. Like, could we do this in wood, or could we do this in hybrid? And if the code allows it, my first conversation with the engineers is, should we then put together a slide deck before we meet with the client where we talk about this so that everybody gets on board early? Nobody in the first workshop is saying, I don't know about that. We've not done that before. You want everybody before, to be on the same page, I think. So we are delivering more than a few projects right now with mass timber. I've also started more than a few projects with mass timber that didn't end up mass timber. I think the projects that are staying mass timber are the ones where the client was already on board with the concept. And in our very first conversations, they thought, this is great. I think we can do this. So there's a few things that have to line up to work. Costs can be one of them. However, if you get in early with the right conversations and you're not designing things twice, some of the costs are less of an issue. Understanding that, like Peter was saying, supply chains will be important. And you typically want a contractor. This used to be a bigger issue, by the way. A lot of contractors will tell you that to build out of concrete and steel will be less. And sometimes it's because they themselves are delivering the concrete and steel. So as the builder, that's just part of their overhead, the teams that deliver the concrete and steel, more typically the concrete. But and so then they were going to have to charge that client more if they had to bring in a builder for the wood, right? Some of the biggest builders in the United States had that very issue. They said, well, it's just going to cost more because it's not my team that's building the wood. It's somebody else. If you buy the concrete from me, my team delivers the concrete. That's changing. More of these big builders in the United States have their own in-house now teams that deliver the mass timber elements, like put them into site, et cetera. So yeah, that's changing. That's a good thing. But we're still 1% or so of the built environment. How much would that have to change? Even if you said, let's double our production of mass timber, non-residential. So we'll get to 2%. But I mean, fundamentally, it's part of the solution. So is decarbonization of concrete and decarbonization of steel. All of those materials are going to be important in the future, and they all need to decarbonize.
Interesting. How do you convince clients to appoint engineers early? Engineers over Saddam, MEP and structural. Have you got some really good convincing power to convince them, or is it like, how do you proceed? Because on a lot of projects, we arrive usually too late and we add costs and complexity, well, especially acoustic and I guess fire as well.
Yeah. But can I from sort of recent perspective, I think some of the projects that we have been working on over the last few years, particularly post-COVID, there has been a kind of, I would say, challenges around finances, which means that the knock-on effect of that is we're often asked to look at a sort of light touch for that early conceptual stage, which is often about trying to prove out a business case or support clients to work towards securing finance. But with that, sometimes it comes with a need to strip down services, which means sometimes consultants you wish would be on board early to help validate some of those early design decisions, which can have a huge impact on carbon saving and across the board, across other sustainability issues. You don't have that input early on, which means you're playing catch up when you're getting into latter stages when financing is secured. So have to retrospectively try and ensure that those things can be built into the design, but again, not impacting on cost envelopes and things like that. So it is really something that when I have the opportunity, when I get wind of that scenario occurring, is to try and advocate for getting consultants on early, because it pays dividends later. So that's something I do push hard here from the London office. I think, Aaron, you probably have similar circumstances, but it'd be interesting to know sort of how it impacts on your work in North America as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of good storytelling that plays a role there. I mean, if you're trying to make the case for having the sustainability consultants on and engaged early, one of the most compelling stories has to do with if you're designing something twice, you're already inefficient, right? So if you've started your workshops with your mechanical engineers and the sustainability team hasn't been engaged, and so nobody's set really targets, they're just going to be code compliant. You might end up finding that you're writing a few design narratives two times, and cost consultants are costing something that isn't really what you want. But if you didn't engage the sustainability team and set the right targets, aligned with a healthy, safe climate, like 1.5 degrees Celsius is still the target, by the way. If you haven't set those targets, your mechanical teams may be designing something twice. Your cost consultants aren't modeling the right equipment. And that's a bad starting point, because if you're making the case that the sustainability doesn't have to cost you more, it actually can introduce all kinds of value in terms of health and wellness. I mean, the biggest cost of most of our clients is in human resource, the productivity and the health and happiness of the workers. Well, if you're not building a building that supports them, that's not a very good asset in the end. And yet there's kind of a miscommunication or missed opportunity a lot of times. So if I make the case, the sustainability team, and basically I'm talking about myself and a couple of other experts I'd like to be in the room. It doesn't have to be a big spend on the part of that consultant. We just want them in the room to be able to talk about, well, we don't have to do that system. We could do this, and that's our experience. We could do that. And then you've already made some progress. So yeah, I have a lot of experiences. They're kind of, some of them are success stories and some of them are not. Obviously, I'd love talking about the success stories, but there's others. I mean, they don't always in the room. Yeah. It's fine. But yeah, that's the story. I mean, get the right people in the room to start, and you'll know what you're designing, and you're not designing it twice.
And I'd say alongside that, one of the things often clients get concerned about is when you start talking about that early engagement, is that's extra cost. How am I going to reconcile that? Very often, consultants are willing to come and talk about these issues. It's something that they are, personally driven by. Either they've got a personal desire to want to make sure projects are pushing the boundaries of sustainability, or it's part of their remit, within their own organizations to want to do something, collectively. So sharing that knowledge they see as vital to that, to sort of scaling up the transition to a net zero carbon economy. So they're very willing to often come in and have those early conversations, without having to secure fees and costs, etc. And then once they're at the table having that discussion, as Aaron said, the clients very quickly understand the value in having them there and not having to go through the design process again. So that's something I think that's definitely something to make sure clients are aware of. It's not about getting it formalized necessarily, getting fees in place, having contracts in place. It's about just having that early discussion with the right people around the table.
There's one discussion I usually have with architects and other designers, especially for timber buildings, whether we should adopt a different type of structure to design and construct buildings, especially timber buildings. I was wondering if you maybe design and build is usually my opinion, is usually better suited because you have a contractor on board and we have more realistic cost implications of the design, and therefore we can have a better steer. That's my opinion, obviously, and this from my experience. It could be very different for others, but also maybe first of all, what do you think? What's your experience on building a timber or a mass timber building? What's the best structure for the design and construction? I'll go on to other things after. What's your opinion?
Yes. The answer is yes. You're right. And you know, a lot of times you're working with we work with some really great structural engineers, and they'll say, okay, look, we can design this to be agnostic as to which species the wood is, or how many layers of wood in the cross-laminated timber the CLT floor plates are. We could be agnostic about a lot of things, but ultimately, you know, you're going to want to lock it in, because not only do you want to lock it in so that you're on the production schedule for that factory, so that there's no time lag and material delivery, et cetera. You know, there's different ways of doing it. I haven't seen it work particularly effective where it's been traditional design, bid, and then build, where the mass timber manufacturer and then installer has been engaged after it's been fully bid. More successful.
You probably need to have very, very experienced people or very experienced designers for this.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's been done. And if you're having some others speak even in the next couple of weeks to this from some of the really big construction companies like Skanska, they'll have some really interesting experiences too. From Grimshaw's experience, I will tell you that we've seen both, and it's more successful when it is in that design build framework. And from the earliest costing kind of approaches, you have that manufacturer and or installer working, hand in glove with the larger GC. You get better pricing. You're less likely to have to design it again, because you're locking in the actual material with the actual capabilities of that material and its actual cost, and you're taking into account any of the potential savings that you're going to get in the schedule, because you've got that much more surety. I mean, you can imagine if you're managing a very big construction and it's mass timber and you don't know who your supplier is going to be, so you've made some allowances for it being this or that, right? All those allowances mean more risk. And same with ultimately, how you're accounting for the schedule. So is there really, one of the values for mass timber is you can build it more quickly than you can concrete, for example. So if you're trying to take its benefits, you want to de-risk as much as you can that kind of the planning, right? So because that in the end makes it also more affordable. So I think that's right. Some clients, depending on the size project, though, maybe don't want to lock in on the price that early. But I'll even tune into the podcast where you have some of the other mass timber providers and some of the big builders together, kind of battle that one out a little bit, because I do think that they'll probably say that each project has a little bit its own kind of issues and opportunities, but I think most people agree with your claim that design build is usually good for mass timber projects. Yes.
We'll organize an episode with you and Skanska.
Okay, great. Yeah, sounds fun.
Go on, Peter.
I was going to, probably the only thing I'd add to Aaron's commentary there in terms of the UK context is obviously with the Building Safety Act and the impact that that's having throughout the industry, it's obviously putting a spotlight possibly unfairly on timber construction. And obviously with that, insurers look at the risks around timber construction. So having that design work done up front and locking in the systems is doubly important in that regard. Because you want to make sure you've de-risked all of those issues before you get to the point where you've got a contract coming on. You want to try and minimize the amount of change to that system once all of the consultants are on board with the design as it sits and that it's gone through all of that due diligence. So I think that from a UK perspective, I think that's a really important point to make.
Yeah. And beyond this also, there's, I'm going to give an example. There's a project, I still bite my teeth on it, but it's an arena where there was going to be made of mass timber, and we were brought on board around stage 3, but very early on we realized we had to redo some design and concept design, so we had to go back. And as now I'm reflecting on it, and it's being paused at the moment because it was costed quite high, not too high, but fairly high. And I realized, because we were really active during the design, because we had to do a very, very nice design, by the way, box in box with, coordinated with the structural engineers, and like it's box supported by another box, and usually it's the outer box supported by the inner box. Anyway, if you know that sort of design. But that was so, I think I can understand why it was expensive, because it was really intense. The design was really intense, and it was not really done too much. But I thought, first of all, if we had been brought on board earlier, and there was more reflection on the modularity of the elements and the construction, maybe that could offset some costs or reduce some costs in a way. And but maybe you need to review. I don't know what's the fault and what's the problem. Did we need to really convince the client to have all the consultants already on board so they could give their view? Maybe all the consultants need to have more experience on modularity, and therefore know also the products available. They may be expensive, but not so expensive to assemble and so quick to assemble. I'm still a bit bittersweet about this. It's paused, but it would be a nice project.
I think you need a lot more engagement with the supplier and the builder community in a specific project region to have confidence that it can be built at that price. I mean, I had one project, it was back in 2015, so a while back, that was meant to be mass timber. It was for a higher ed client, and it was in a part of New Jersey where there simply, there wasn't any builder who'd ever built with mass timber. And our risk manager and cost consultant, it was a little project, by the way, but we did bring in like Grimshaw's usual kind of leadership and expert class group folk. Anyway, it's just to say, one thing that was missed at that time was just how impactful it would be that nobody within a few hundred miles really had delivered a mass timber project. So when the pricing came in, it was 3 or 4 times higher what anybody thought it would be. And we thought that, well, these teams come in and move really quickly. They can install this. This was not a big project. They could have installed it in a week or two. But it had a huge cost impact, and they had to redesign it. Or we had to redesign it. And so, like the engaging the full supply chain for mass timber projects is pretty important. And I mean, that was 10 years ago. It really depends, right? It depends on where the project is. So we've had projects that were mass timber in the Middle East, on the Red Sea. If you don't know where it's coming from and who's going to actually build it, like which teams are very likely to build it, you have to have all those conversations. I mean, otherwise, I think you're not even doing a service to the industry if you're not having those conversations, because you're telling stories that it's hard to do it. And that's not a good story to tell. I think that you have to just do it right, and it won't always work. I think if you follow best practice, you're engaging the industry early, and you're building the project up and setting it up for success, and you're not waiting until you're halfway through your initial design package to reach out to the industry. I think you really want them as soon as makes sense. As soon as you have the earliest concept designs, you want to start sharing, this is a project we're thinking of doing. It's about this size, reaching out to the trade industries. Like in North America, we have Woodworks, which helps projects get good background information on what's being built where and with what resource. And they're willing to show up and talk to clients to walk them through some of the risk challenges. They're willing to even look at cost models and say, this doesn't look quite right. You might talk to your contractor about this part of the foundations, which should be less, et cetera, with mass timber. So there's a lot of organizational support to help that capacity building. But I think to be set up for success, you're talking to that supply chain early. Yeah.
Peter.
I was going to say, on a slightly different perspective, but still related to mass timber and glulam and CLT. I think one of the insights we got over the last few years has been through a research project that we were heavily involved in that was EU funded. That's something we didn't talk about earlier, actually, but another part of our remit is to actually worked with others and partners to develop research that's at the cutting edge of sort of material science and construction innovation. So that's something we look across the market to look for opportunities. And one that presented itself back in 2019 was the Circuit project, which is looking at circular construction in regenerative cities. And it was a collaboration across 4 cities: London, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Hamburg. And we were looking at developing demonstrators that could show how you could scale circular construction practices across those different markets, look at what the barriers were, and look at what legislative change would need to come into effect in order to facilitate their uptake and their scalability. And one of the specific demonstrators that we looked at in the UK was looking at secondary timber as a source. And I think there's 2 parts to that are advantageous, sort of worth sort of looking at in this context. Is that we talk a lot about one of the advantages for timber is having a carbon sink within the built environment. In order to do that, you have to make sure you divert flows of demolition waste. In the UK specifically, it's over I think it's to check my notes here just to make sure I get the right number. Yeah, 2.3 million tons of waste is produced annually just within the UK. But a lot of that gets downcycled. The stuff that gets captured and recirculated gets chipped and turned into lower grade products that aren't structural. So we looked specifically at, could we capture that flow and convert it into reuse and upcycling it so that we could generate structural members that were glued out, CLT, part of other systems. That research we did in collaboration with a company called Simple Works, who are based in the UK, in London. And we collaborated with them to look at, can we source the timber? How do we go about characterizing the timber that's suitable for reuse? And then working with a fabricator in the UK that specializes in glulam, called Buckland Timber, based in the southwest of England. Can we create glulam beams? Can we find the right pieces that were suitable for that process? What were the challenges in terms of milling that timber and turning it into those glulam beams? And then what was the performance compared to using virgin timber that could be utilized as an alternative? So we went through that process, and it was a fascinating and fantastic experience, because we actually rolled out our sleeves. It was the middle of COVID. So we actually, within Grimshaw, some of my colleagues actually rolled their sleeves up and took delivery of tons of timber to our office, which they then had to sort through visually, log. They then had to do all of the testing to characterize it. But that hands-on experience gave us a wealth of knowledge in terms of the complexity of that process. And the results of that, the findings that we published in a paper, which is available for download on the Circuit website. I think we could probably put links to some of the things, this and others that we've talked about.
You have to send it, yeah,
into the page when this gets published. But the findings were essentially that the performance of those glulam beams was comparable to those made from virgin timber, which was really valuable to be able to demonstrate that process can be done. But also, it was really great to get insights from Buckland Timber in terms of the challenges around having to deal with reuse secondary timbers. One of those being that it's very hard to take out all of the metal components that are buried within that timber. You can do a visual screen. You can take out things that are, apparent on the surface, but when you start milling, every time you hit a nail that's embedded, the milling machine had to have its bit replaced. That was thousands of pounds. But it was great to sort of do that learning through doing, and actually understand that it's not that you can't do these things, it's that you just have to be aware of those challenges, and you have to have workarounds in part of that workflow. But that project, one of the things we were asked to do was look at what potential for scaling that would be across the UK and Europe. I think one of the things that's always a challenge when you talk about circular design or the reuse of materials or products is understanding how that scale is really going to work. Can you fully meet the needs of future generations within sort of the floor area that we need to build, even just within Europe, by using purely recirculated materials? And I think the answer there is that it's not going to be as easy as just closing the loop, whilst we still have this economic model of endless growth. So one of the challenges there is you've got to meet the demand for those new materials with also a bit of a reality check on how you actually facilitate demand. Now, in the UK, there's a lot of conversations going on around the government's commitment to housing. And Aaron touched on housing being probably the dominant use case for timber in the US market. There's a position paper that came out recently in the UK looking at developing timber as a roadmap in the UK, and looking at how timber can be used to facilitate this 1.5 billion homes that we want to build within the next parliament. If you take that 1.5 billion homes and you look at what through the Circuit project and others have done to sort of look at the scalability of secondary timber, you're only looking realistically about meeting 1% of the demand in terms of building those homes on an annual basis. That could potentially be pushed further in terms of really streamlining those flows of materials, capturing as much timber as possible, putting that back into circulation. So it has a limited impact, but I think it helps. There's a bigger picture. It helps change mindsets around how we manage materials responsibly, but it also has that secondary impact, which is if you can ensure that timber is staying within the built environment, within a carbon sink. Going back to what I talked about earlier, this challenges around how you look at the whole life picture of the carbon impact of timber. When you can start to reassure people that that end of life scenario has been sufficiently managed and that there's a full loop back in, you'll then get a kind of compound effect over the next 25 to 30 years, where that 1% over that period of time will have a significant impact in terms of managing that carbon sink and helping it to grow. So I think that's a really important part of how you look at timber holistically, not just, there's impacts around growing forests and having more managed forests to increase that supply of timber. We've also got to look at the other end of the whole life cycle process and sort of make sure that we're custodians and being responsible across that whole supply chain and that whole life cycle for the whole built environment.
Give me
big issue, big topic.
Give me a second. I need to block my door because my kids may come in. They come back from school.
Okay. I thought maybe they joined the podcast, occasionally.
Yeah, I think mine will be coming through the door momentarily.
I love it. That's a good thing about doing, late afternoon podcasts in the UK. The kids come home. I mean, it's like kind of a good way to end the podcast, though.
Go on, Aaron.
Right, sure. I was just going to add to what Peter was saying about the wood and the reuse of wood being an important component, because if we are going to use it to get to this target that the UN High-Level Climate Champions Embodied Carbon in Buildings Initiative has suggested, that 40% reduction in embodied carbon, if we're going to do that and we're going to take the biogenic carbon storage on the back end, if you will, to get to that 40%, then we really want to be clear and be building capacity for the reuse of that wood in a productive way. Because a lot of engineers, some at Borough Happel, for example, that I've worked with in Bath, we're on a project, we're saying, you have to assume the worst because the climate imperative requires us to assume the worst. And the worst is that somebody burns that when they take that building apart, in 60 years, maybe right away. We're still going to be obviously dealing with climate and climate action for this, probably for most of this century, right? I mean, if our goal is 1.5 degrees Celsius and we're nearly already there, then we're on the 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot pathway, which means we're going to bypass 1.5, but we got to bring it back down before the end of the century, which means we have to do a really good job on carbon sinks in the world, which are forests and bogs that you guys know about in the UK, and other important places to sink that carbon, but also in these building materials. So we need to reuse them. I'll add on the wood reuse piece. There's a great group in the Bay Area called Urban Machine that are using computer optics and AI to scan wood that comes through their labs, and they're denailing it with a robot. And so, there's a lot of action here. I'm not sure there's a lot of action. There is some action, right? Peter's research, Urban Machine. The other thing is on deconstruction. And in sustainability, we often talk about negative externalities, right? To use the economic term. So if something has a negative externality, it has negative impacts, but they're not a part of its price, right? So like demolishing a building in downtown New York City or something like that, you're gonna take it down as quickly as possible with the least amount of cost, and you're gonna ship it as waste to probably New Jersey or, somewhere else. It's going to be out of mind, et cetera. Well, there's other places in the world that are saying there's a lot of negative externalities when it comes to demolition. A lot of those materials are toxic. A lot of those materials could have been reused, et cetera. So you can look at a city like Boulder, Colorado, that have a deconstruction ordinance. And so that means you really have to take apart the building and try to reuse as much of it as possible. So very little in the end, like less than 10% would ever go to landfill. And then most of it's going to try to remain within its use, like highest use cycle, not downcycled, like, chipped up or something like that. So the city of Boulder has got this going, and they've just put their money where their mouth is and trying to walk the walk by deconstructing a hospital. They took apart a full institutional hospital. A lot of people are used to deconstruction at the scale of houses, especially when it has some historic quality where it might be even rebuilt somewhere else. But in this case, they took apart a hospital and they were very transparent about it. They said it did cost more. Of course it did. That is part of what the whole issue of negative externalities is. Part of what we should be doing, not as architects, we can advocate for it. As engineers, you guys can advocate for it. We can all go to advocate with our elected officials. We need to make sure that the costs of these things that we're doing in the built environment are internalized. So the policy to support the internalization of those externalities. So deconstruction is one way of doing that. So there's a great case study that they put forward if you're trying to see like who's doing deconstruction and who's showing and being transparent about its challenges. They're doing a good job there in Boulder.
It seems to be the next thing beyond after mass timber. Reusing materials. There's quite a few guests now that have talked about it on the podcast. There's one guest, I can't mention the name yet, but we've invited them and they're really at the center of reusing materials from buildings. They haven't answered, given a positive answer yet, but I'm really hoping to have more on this. And also because we are really interested for acoustics. I mean, we've looked into reclaimed paving slabs, not only for gym floors, floating floor systems, but also to put mass on concrete, on roof, to replace concrete. And there's a big challenge around if you reuse acoustic products, how can you make sure they still perform the same? And I guess it's the same for a lot of other products as well. That's the challenge. But it seems like the market is becoming more and more mature, and there's a lot of research and focus on it, and more and more. That's what I'm saying. Also, obviously, disassembly, designing for disassembly as well is quite a big thing. But yeah, and this it was one of the question I was going to ask you. But yeah, it's.
Can I add that to the Mark?
Yeah,
part of that designing for disassembly, which is something that Grimshaw is talking about in designing for manufacturing. So as you're taking advantage of performance and less waste, meaning should be lower cost, but is material passports, and specifically for steel, where steel can be reused and not have it as long as one understands the grade of the steel and a number of other factors, it can really be just reused. So instead of having to melt it down, a lot of times in the US, we feel really good about ourselves because we've got all this extra steel. We just melt it down and reuse it in our electric arc furnaces and are like, that's a really low carbon, climate active solution. But actually, it's just our market. Which we're lucky we have all that steel we can melt down. If we're really honest, what we're going to be doing is decarbonizing steel globally across the markets, right? And investing in those technologies. Maybe you'll have somebody come on and talk about that and kind of the future of how hydrogen kind of economy kind of supports that. But definitely reusing steel, not having to melt it down, but reusing it as the building is deconstructed with material passports is part of that. And there's some great folks in steel like Tata and others that Peter probably is familiar with too, that are very close to be able to say, we can add the material passport to your steel, because you at least want to do material passports for those really high embodied carbon materials that have a really high potential for reuse in a deconstruction environment. So,
yeah, I think there's definitely getting more engagement from those sorts of organisations who are promoting the products and the infrastructure in place to show that validation of products coming through from reuse from source. And and back into the open market again, and all of the warranty testing and things like that. I think that whole industry that needs to emerge around circular construction materials is just really getting going now. You're seeing the likes of companies like Madasta, who are a platform for managing material passports, and other organizations coming together to try and standardize what a material passport is. You're seeing that happen now across Europe and in the UK. And I think also I've seen papers from the US market as well around how to self-organize in that regard. And I think technology is a key part of that, having these platforms to catalog materials that are available so that you can start to engage with suppliers early enough so you can see what's available. You can start to even adapt your design to fit with what's available or what will be available at the point at which you need it. So starting to think about design, it gives you a slightly different perspective from the way that you design when you've got only a certain number of items or certain lengths that you need to work to. It's starting to understand how you can adapt the way you think and how you approach design in order to accommodate as much of that potential reuse as possible. So I think there's a fantastic amount of momentum now that's kicking in that regard. And we're seeing legislation obviously help push that forward as well within London. Particularly you look at the London plan, and the GLA are now requiring developments over a certain size that have to undertake a pre-demolition audit and a pre-development audit to justify if demolition is going to occur, why is it going to happen, what's the business case for that, where are those materials going to be reused. So that's, again, I imagine in other markets in North America, that's starting to be discussed.
Yeah, and
Yes.
if you want to find another good reference point, New York City, their Economic Development Corporation just published their circular design and construction guidelines. So that's New York City trying to implement best practice when it comes to circularity. And they're further supported by groups like just in New York State, that Cornell's Circular Construction Lab. There's a great leader there, Felix Heisel, who also has positions in Europe at universities. And their work on circularity is great. They deconstruct homes to kind of show how quickly this could be done and effectively, et cetera. So they've got also good case studies on the Cornell Circular Construction Lab website.
Great. I think we're reaching the end of the episode. I think it'd probably be worth organizing other episodes to talk about every single project you've worked on, because they sound really interesting. Especially the project you were working on at Peter with Simple Work sounds really interesting. It'd be really good to organize something with them as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
But yeah, brief.
I was going to say there's a wealth of case studies on our website. If you go to our sustainability homepage, myself and Aaron spent a long time with colleagues trying to make sure that the information and the learnings of our projects aren't sort of buried with time, but we make sure that we refresh that case study library so that it's accessible, so people can download information, learn more about those projects. Some of the ones we've discussed today are up there. And the Circuit project has its website, which is circuit-project.eu, which is
put it in the comments.
All of the papers. And I think another thing that we've done more recently, which has really helped in terms of pulling all this vast amount of information and guidance together around product selection, decarbonising, and looking at the whole thing across the value chain, has been our efforts to develop a platform called Minoro. So a lot of the things we talked about today are available on that platform. Minoro was something we did in collaboration with World Green Building Council and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, who funded the project. And it was really born out of the work that we did internally to create pathways for decarbonising our projects. We wanted, again, to make sure that wasn't lost or wasn't just internally utilised. So we've taken those learnings, put those onto the Minoro platform, and made that free to the market, to the wider built environment, in order to facilitate and accelerate the decarbonisation of the built environment. So there's a wealth of knowledge that's specific to the regions that we operate in. I think currently, I forget the exact number of countries that we cover, but you can, with a drop down within Minoro, select your region or country, and it'll update the content based on that region and show you relevant guidance and examples and project case studies that you can utilize, to share with your clients, and hopefully, your listeners can utilize that to get sustainability on the agenda and decarbonisation on the agenda for their clients, and hopefully push that forward on their projects as well.
Yeah, definitely. How can we get in touch with you if people want to reach out?
If people want to reach out to us,
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn
like
is probably
LinkedIn.
the
I'll put both links to your profiles in the description as well. But
I
yeah,
like
thank
that
you very
space
much.
too. We have a lot of work
go
to
on.
do, don't we? I was just going to say, I mean, LinkedIn is a space where the community of those folks in built environment who are quite focused on sustainability are very active. And I think that there's a lot of goodwill and interest in community building, certainly in North America right now. So, yeah, I mean, I'm very active there. So if you reach out to me, I'm liable to respond within a few days. So, yeah.
Great, yeah.
Likewise,
well, thank you very much, both. I would have liked to the episode to last longer. Maybe we'll organize another like a part 2 of the episodes if there's
We
more
would
to
be more
talk
than
about.
happy
But
to.
yeah, thank you again. And
Yeah, I mean, I had
hopefully
questions for you, Mark, but that's how the podcast works. It's usually a one-way kind of street. I guess I just have to. I'll come up with something, a topic where I can bug you and ask you questions too about acoustics. We didn't talk about the fact that mass timber, a lot of people think has acoustic issues, but anyway, maybe that's another time. It doesn't actually. All those can be addressed.
We'll organize a part 2, and you'll organize. You'll ask me the questions. You'll be the host,
sure,
and I'll be the guest.
Okay.
Okay. Well, great to speak to you both, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you very much. Bye. Cheers.
Bye, guys.